Hello, friends. Welcome to Logistics of Logistics podcast. My name is Joe Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's topic is market insights with supply chain economist Jason Miller. How's it going, Jason?
It's going well. How you doing, Joe?
Doing great. So, Jason, please introduce yourself and your organization and where you're calling from today.
Yep, my name's Jason Miller. I'm the Eli Broad Professor in Supply Chain Management at Michigan State University. So I'm calling in from sunny East Lansing at the moment.
It's not sunny in East Lansing.
It's trying to slowly but
Well,
surely.
I'm like 40 minutes from you, so it's not sunny here, but we get good weather right now. So Eli Broad was I think he's passed away, but he was a really successful businessman, and he's what you guys named your business school after, right?
Yep. He provided the naming gift back in 1994, I believe.
I think his claim to fame is he had 2 Fortune 500 companies that he started.
Yep, that is correct.
That's a pretty good paying job, I think.
Very successful gentleman.
So, Jason, what do you do over at Michigan State University?
So right now I've got one more year left as interim department head. So about half of my responsibilities are as an administrator, but primarily in a role of faculty member. We're almost exclusively researchers. So I spend most of my time not doing administration, working on peer-reviewed journal articles of various forms. And then I do an extensive amount of outreach and engagement with industry, very much in this supply chain economist role. So I spend a decent share of other time looking at data, processing data that's coming in, and just trying to really get a sense of where different aspects of the economy, especially as it pertains to the various buckets of supply chain, is at.
Yep. You've been on my podcast a few times. One time we did a podcast called Supply Chain Basics. I'll make sure we put a link to that in the show notes. Another time we talked about the supply chain from 1940 to 2040, and we used the skillet as the constant, because the skillet hasn't changed much. It's probably man's oldest tool. And I love doing those podcasts. But somewhere along the line, you said, "Oh, I think of myself as a supply chain economist," and I've always thought about that. And so today, when we were talking about doing the podcast, I said, "I really want to call you the supply chain economist," because so often you hear economists speak, and you don't think, "Oh, what is that guy? What does that have to do with me?" It feels like it's very macro. And I know you bring it down to the level of the freight guys. And if you aren't already following Jason Miller on LinkedIn, you need to, because he has fantastic insights on where the market is going. And I can always tell by the engagement, but also the conversations and who's chiming in on those conversations, that it is good insights. So please follow Jason Miller. Probably not easy to find Jason Miller unless you type in Michigan State, because there's a million Jason Millers on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Probably the easiest way to find me is Jason Miller, MSU. Go to my department webpage, and that has a link to my LinkedIn profile. Makes the search.
I'll put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes too. So, Jason, I wanted to cover a few things. So I think before we hit record, we talked about 3 major areas that we wanted to talk about. And the first area I wanted to talk to you about was the freight markets. And so there's really 3 that we want to talk about, which is the dry van over the road, containerized, and then air freight. And I know we're in a down market, and everybody's looking and saying, when are we going to pull out of this down market? And everyone wants a promise, but no one can give that promise because no one knows the future. But talk first about the dry van market. What's going on, and when do you see it clearing up?
As we've been in essentially a freight recession since really about late Q2 maybe late Q2, but probably Q3 of 2022 was when the downturn really started from a volume standpoint. Spot pricing started to weaken a little bit earlier 2022. We've been really moving along a trough in terms of both spot pricing, really over about the last year. If you look at DAT's dry van spot rate, including fuel surcharge, it's basically flat year over year right now here in June. The producer price index for the dry van over the road sector is down a couple percent year over year, but it'll be at neutrality here in a couple months with the way things are at. So pricing's moving along a trough. Demand's moving along a trough right now. The seasonally adjusted trucking ton mile index I co-author with Yembo Yamole at the University of Tennessee. We're just month up, month down, month up, month down. We're just moving essentially just right along the bottom of this trough at the moment. We are seeing capacity leaving the market, and that is going to at least help put a floor on rates. My sense is that spot rates did hit a floor, and that was in April of this year, which means contract rates, the floor for that will be very soonly hit if we're not already there. The challenges now is what gets us off of this floor. A lot of folks in industry seem to want to hope that enough capacity exits to flip the market. I do not believe that will happen. There is not a recorded instance of us exiting a bear market into a bull market because too much capacity left. There's always some type of surge of demand that essentially comes on a little bit unexpected. And right now it's difficult as we look at the rest of 24 to see where could that demand surge come
Oh, that's interesting. So I'm no expert like you when it comes to capacity and then the demand. So we've been in this trough, as you said, for a few years now, and flat, right? And I've been under the impression, and I've said on my podcast, is armies need to leave the field. We need the trucking company that has 100 needs to go down to 90. The little onesie twosie companies that have one or two trucks need to leave. These are all unfortunate for these companies and these individuals, but for the greater good, that's how I've always seen it. When the armies leave the field, there'll be fewer, less capacity in the market. Therefore, the rates go up. But you say we need something that will drive the demand up. So we had COVID. No one wants another COVID, but there's going to be something in the economy that drives that up beyond just capacity leaving.
Yeah, and if you think the last sort of or call it three normal market cycles, 2004, we have got a housing boom like no other that we've seen. Housing activity takes off, that pulls a lot of freight demand. And we then entered a huge commodity market cycle in 2006, 2007 that helped stimulate a tremendous amount of demand, including the start of hydraulic fracturing starting in that 2006, 2007 era. Kind of the next, and then obviously the global financial crisis hits, the US economy effectively collapses, trucking demand declines 20%. We have 15% capacity leaves the industry between January of 2007 and March of 2010. So we had over a 3-year period where payrolls declined. Then you had the next up cycle that was beyond just a recessionary recovery, was really 2013 and 2014. That was heavily fueled by a commodity market boom in the ag space, which caused a tremendous increase in heavy equipment purchases, especially farm machinery and all the knock-on demand that generates for steel, fabricated metal products, etc. But you also had fracking was going absolutely gangbusters during that period. I lived in Colorado at that time, and just everywhere you turned, they were fracking. And so 2015 hits, fracking falls off of a cliff into a drop in 2016. Commodity markets are soft. We're in a freight recession. No, it's not that deep because housing's still recovering from post GFC lows. And then 2017 hits, and we have commodity prices start to rise. And we also had just robust global activity, spurred strong growth in U.S. manufacturing. Again, fracking played a huge role in this. I don't think we tend to underestimate that. A lot of people attribute some of the shock to Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. And while that certainly did stimulate some demand, to make it very clear, because there's been some statements made this year, well, it's supposed to be an active Atlantic hurricane season. That don't mean much.
So no one pray for hurricanes? Is that what you're telling us?
Yeah, folks are saying, could that flip the market? My answer is absolutely not. There's only been one storm in essentially modern freight history that generated so much demand that it did prolong a cycle, and that was Katrina. And just to make it clear, the damage from Katrina and the surge of production that caused for lumber and building materials and things of that sort is orders of magnitude higher than the surge that we saw in response to Harvey. So all of those cycles, every one of them is involving some type of demand surge, typically coming from domestic manufacturing, oftentimes being pulled because we've got a commodity market boom or a fracking boom. You look at 2024, we've missed our opportunity for a increase in residential investment. I was just checking May single family housing starts seasonally adjusted were down, which doesn't surprise me because we didn't get the promised interest rate cuts coming.
Yeah, it's before we hit record, we were talking about if Trump was to win in the next election, whether you like that or not, it doesn't matter. We just talk about the economics of it, is he's talked about having more tariffs for China, which I guess would mean we'd be doing more with our partners outside of China, maybe still in Asia, maybe here in the US or in Latin America, but somewhere else. Would that be a temporary boom to that, or what would that look like?
Yeah, so a lot of what I'm going to say is based off of extensive economics research that's been done on the effects of the Trump tariffs. The most recent paper by David Artur and colleagues from MIT, to make it very clear, the domestic manufacturing sectors that were protected by the Trump tariffs added effectively zero employment. We had no meaningful increase in domestic manufacturing output. We did have an increase in domestic manufacturing prices, though. I couldn't imagine why that would occur. But the industries that were targeted for retaliation saw substantial declines in employment, especially the ag space, as well as the industries that provide inputs to those targeted industries. So on net, the tariffs have been a negative for economic activity.
And always will be. That's just the nature of tariffs. And I think emotionally, a lot of us go, oh, I want to do that because I want to protect these jobs. It always hurts consumers. There's no place where you will be where a protected industry doesn't raise prices when they're protected. I used to work in Thailand and they have local content there. And I remember while working with the companies, local content was 30% of the vehicles that I worked on, Jeeps. And I remember everybody in Thailand knew they were paying extra for those cars, but they had to. And again, there was people who were making a lot of money who were the partners of the automakers. And so it's always the same. I think emotionally, and maybe just first thought is we're going to punish that country for whatever. You're punishing the consumers.
And a good way to think about this is U.S. manufacturing of steel and whatnot. If you look after the global financial crisis, the high water mark for production domestically of steel in the United States is from 2012 through 2014, during the midst of a fracking boom and during the midst of an agricultural commodity boom. There was a little bit of an increase in 2018, and that was because demand was essentially strong. But in 2019, steel production dropped sharply. Guess what? Steel production rebounded in 2021 because we had a lot of demand for construction, and it fell in 22, it fell in 23, and it's not very strong this year. So as I think what would play out with, let's say President Trump gets reelected, gets in office, and they say, okay, come January 1, 2026, this 10% global tariff and 60% China tariff goes into effect. So we've got 12 months. You will first off see a tremendous surge in imports.
One good year.
People are going to front load like you've never seen front loading before, because that is the optimal decision. I can show you
extra inventory.
Yeah. I can show you that from the economic order quantity, that if you say price is going to go up 10%, I am going to absolutely load up right now. So you're going to see a tremendous surge in containerized imports. You're going to see a surge in air freight. The amount of imports that are going to pour into this country will be effectively comical if this takes place. That will probably cause some inland disruptions, and we'll have a currents not nearly as bad as 2021, but we're going to have some of the same dynamics. But then 2026 will show up, and you will see 2023's dry up, but on steroids, because everybody's going to have brought in what they needed to bring in ahead of time.
Inventory glut in effect at that point.
Oh, yeah. And this is the key thing. Retaliatory tariffs will absolutely trash export-sensitive U.S. sectors, and that is going to cause a net loss of freight demand. Because here's the key thing to understand. You can go access what exactly the US exports to every country in the world at the 10-digit harmonized system level and know the exact value of that from the Census Bureau's publicly facing database. I promise you, folks know that. So what you'll see is US ag will get decimated, US machinery. I would not want to be producing, for example, John Deere tractors for top
Right.
exporters. Boeing is going to have even more joys than it already is having with its quality issues. So you're going to see all these different US sectors will get hit with retaliatory tariffs. That is going to decrease their demand. You'll see domestic manufacturers say, hey, I have to use these foreign inputs. I can't source them domestically at an effective price. So if I can't buy this at the old cost, I'm just not going to produce that product. And so it will be absolutely a negative net impact. We're not going to tariff our way to prosperity. And quite frankly, both administrations do not seem to understand that. It is understandable, let's say, the targeting of Chinese electric vehicles. There is a tremendous amount of government subsidization taking place there. So maybe for some very specific categories, we have to have the conversation, but a blanket 60% tariff is silly.
By the way, one of the things I know is happening, and I know you probably already have done some research on, Jason, is how many Chinese companies are setting up shop in Mexico. So when the tariffs do come, and again, some of them will be on automotive stuff, and I think they're set up shop. And I say it's for two reasons. First off, because they have customers that they want to keep, so they move to Mexico. And secondly, if you're a Chinese person who owns a company, you can take the bag out of China.
No, and there's no doubt of that. We've seen a tremendous amount of shifting. For example, Vietnam is exporting so much more to the United States. Some of that is a shifting of goods that were being assembled in China now being assembled in Vietnam. Here's the key thing. All the inputs are still coming from China. I do suspect a lot of the, let's say, increase in cross-border northbound truck shipments from Mexico to the United States is effectively Chinese goods being produced in China, being shipped over to Mexico in containers, maybe having a box put on that says made in Mexico.
Right.
And
And that is the way a lot of, when I used to work, I mentioned Thailand and China, we used to have a lot of stuff that was passed through. So it was basically just labeled made here. So that is the way of the world. As long as we have bureaucrats deciding how things should be shipped, we can always change boxes. Logistics people and supply chain people are very good at changing boxes around. So you said that we're going to need something external. It's not just going to be capacity leaving the market that's going to help us. The nearshoring, which we're seeing a little bit, I think that at least trickles of that. Will that be part of the answer? Because I know you and I've had previous conversations about even as stuff moves back here, it's not going to be to the same level of manufacturing employment as the past. It'll be much more automated. And by the way, the stuff that moved away from here, maybe moved to China 30 years ago, it's been automated in China. So when it moves back here, it's going to be automated. And it might not move necessarily here. It could move to somewhere in Latin America and be shipped back up here. What do you think? Will that help? Will that help this? Will nearshoring be part of the answer?
nearshoring has the potential to increase those southbound freight volumes, especially for manufacturers in Texas, Arizona, Southern California that are close to the border. It will not help folks nearly as much if they're up here in Michigan or in Wisconsin, because at the end of the day, total landed cost, if you're having to truck something across the United States, still makes you less cost competitive. So there certainly could be some benefits from that. It really depends, though, where these parts are going to be coming from. My concern with a lot of this, and you mentioned Chinese companies setting up shop in Mexico for final assembly, if they're buying all of the inputs from China and still shipping those in containers, we don't see those knock-on effects. And so it really depends for reshoring where the parts ecosystem is located at. And so I think that to me is the big question. I'm not convinced yet we're going to see enough of the part ecosystem originate here in the US to really meaningfully change things. My general sense is that it will take interest rate cuts and more than 25 basis points. It's going to take 100 basis points of cuts, 125 basis points of cuts. It puts us down around federal funds target rate of about 4%. That would be stimulative because you will see housing activity pick up and the rebound there. So to me, probably the big thing is just going to be the Fed cutting interest rates.
So the overall economy improving somehow. That's interesting because, again, I think so many of us think if enough trucking companies close, the market will bump back up. But it's going to take something more than that. But generally speaking, do you feel like the first quarter of next year is better than it is right now?
First quarter, I'm going to say the question is, does the second quarter of next year? Because first quarter is always the softest quarter for freight volumes. My anticipation would be yes, it will be better than it is now, regardless of who's in the White House, because we should have at least one, if not two, interest rate cuts at that point. I'm a firm believer that we could cut interest rates now and not have any inflationary concerns at the moment, just due to some complexities with how inflation's calculated. If you use the European approach, suggests we're at 2% and we have been for an extended period. So we could essentially start cutting with limited concerns. I do feel regardless of who's in office, next quarter of this year will be better. Where it's a little harder for me to tell is second quarter of 26.
So we talked about the dry van or the over-the-road market. Talk a little bit about the containerized freight. Does all the things you just described still apply to that? What does that market look like going forward?
So that market, especially on a spot rate basis, is doing phenomenal at the moment because effectively of I'm going to call it an artificial demand shock. Now, a lot of folks tend to focus on the Red Sea closure as in the Suez Canal closure as a supply shock. And to me, that's misplaced. This is about demand because demand for container shipping is measured as TEU miles or TEU kilometers. And what the Red Sea closure did,
TEU stands for what?
20 foot equivalent unit.
So most of the freight moves in 40-foot containers, but we still use TEU 20. What does it say? They say it again?
TEU miles, or you can call
So
it
that's the
FEU.
equivalent.
Yep. Yep. And when you think about it, the ports all report things on a TEU basis rather than an FEU basis.
Lowest common denominator.
Yep. But when you think about it, the Red Sea closure represents this huge demand shock, especially for freight coming from South Asia, such as India, and going to the US that normally would have transited through the Suez Canal and now has to go around Africa. So you have this huge increase in demand because the mileage component, and yes, the number of containers being moved is also up, but the bigger shock is on the mileage piece. But it doesn't really matter from an ocean carrier standpoint. You have this big disruption that takes place, a lot of longer routing, containers are out of place. You start having some log jams build up here and there. And then you've got concerns about an East Coast and Gulf Coast port strike that's likely resulting in a little bit of imports being pulled forward. And you have a recipe for spot rates going up substantially. So they're about 3 times higher today, 3 to 4 times higher than what they were before COVID. No container trade statistics data for what the carriers are actually getting paid has not went up nearly as much as that. CTS's data is only up about 15% from before COVID so far through their reading in April, and that's referring to Transpac to the US West Coast. Right now, it seems that we're not likely to see those prices come down really sharply in, let's say, the next 2 or 3 months. But I would expect if some of this is pulled forward, we could start seeing things ease as we get towards the end of the year, where essentially we've missed the window for getting stuff over to the US or to Europe for holidays. The real question is, where do things end up in 25? If you have, again, this potential for a huge import surge because of front loading, because of imports, because tariffs are going into effect, guess what, everybody? You can say hello to those $20,000 and $30,000 per FEU rates again, because that's what we'll be staring at if you have this huge surge in demand.
Hopefully we don't end up with those massive tariffs, but time will tell. Jason, I want to get your 2 cents on the 2 kind of log jams we've seen in the last year or so. So you touched on the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. I think 12% of global freight moves through there every year, or I think on a dollar basis. and I think the Panama Canal, which is like 5%. So we've got a drought down there, and we can't get all the big boats. We can't get as many boats through there. And in the Red Sea, we have the Houthi rebels disrupting traffic over there. And I think that's related to the conflict in Israel and Gaza. So, by the way, I think somebody mentioned on my podcast, it's the first time that we've seen drones stop boats. So we've always had you think, and relatively simple drones. And so it's interesting. And I know boats are still going through there if they have oil in them. And if they're coming from Iran, they go through. I believe some Chinese ships are getting through. But now if I'm shipping, I have to be a lot more flexible here because I might not receive it on the West Coast. I might receive it on the East Coast. And I might have my infrastructure set up for I've always received that on the West Coast, or I've always received it on the East Coast. It feels like the bar is still very high for consumers here and for businesses here on get me my stuff, get me my container here. But now we have disruption, and it feels like that we were in a brand new world where we just have to live with that disruptive container flow.
No, we do. I will say, though, is we are not seeing anywhere near the reported type of disruptions, especially if we focus on manufacturers. And many of the largest U.S. manufacturers are major users of containerized imports. So don't get this wrong, that they'd be unaffected. And so we're not seeing from Census Bureau data, they're not reporting material shortages and things like that going up like we would expect, like I think many folks expected. The same way the European manufacturers are not, who are arguably even more affected by the Red Sea closure, they're not reporting really issues and material shortages right now being anything out of the ordinary. And by out of the ordinary, we're effectively back to 2018, 2019 levels. And so I think we've gotten better at handling disruptions. I think the key difference between in the ocean side between today versus 2021, when things really started to get bad, is 2021 was about the number of TEUs, and that's what cascades inland. Today, it's really about the longer miles in terms of that TEU mile demand picture. And so while that affects the pricing on the ocean side, at the end of the day, the number of containers going to Europe or coming to the US is not what it even was in 2022. So we have the ability to process those.
Yep. And so the reason they're going longer is because they're going around South America potentially rather than going through the canal, Panama Canal, and they're going the long way around Africa to avoid that Suez Canal. So, yeah, it's a testament to the logistics people for keeping, we don't have disruptions in our manufacturing. And the reason is because we're making those adjustments. I don't think we would have done that as well 30 years ago.
Yep. No, we would not have.
Yep. So I want to talk also one last freight market. Talk about the air freight market.
Yeah, so air freight is quite interesting, and specifically different parts of Asia to the US right now, because we have out of India, air freight volumes are substantially higher than what they've been. That a lot of that is, again, more time sensitive goods, higher value goods. You say an extra 10, 12 days of lead time, I'm putting it on a plane. I'm not putting it on a container ship. Out of China, we have a dynamic that really took off full force last year towards the fourth quarter. And it was nobody really saw this coming as far as I can tell. And that is just a surge of e-commerce demand, which is American consumers buying cheap stuff from Shein and Temu and JD and Alibaba. And it's coming over to the US by air freight. And so a lot of this is because of the de minimis exemption, which basically says if it's under 800, essentially a shipment a day to a given individual, if it's under $800, nobody cares. And that's going to get, I think, a very close look from Congress. And we're already starting to see Customs and Border Patrol cracking down on several 3PLs that may not be doing the most comprehensive job of handling reporting and paperwork on this. And so we've just seen this tremendous surge of air freight demand that we're up double digits year over year. And nobody really expected that at the moment. Now, we're not seeing contract prices go up nearly as much, which is consistent with the fact that your major US importers and users of air freight aren't seeing tremendous demand, but it's really this sort of Chinese e-commerce piece. To the point that IATA, the International Air Transportation Association, just put out a call saying, we need to actually track and better understand what is e-commerce that is moving by air, because this is now such an important piece that we've never adequately looked at.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the companies you mentioned and Temu, I watch YouTube, and they're always advertising to me to buy this stuff. And it's, I would also say it's interesting when you look at those short advertisements. I always keep thinking, yeah, this is probably not meant for necessarily a US audience. So I think they just use the same ads worldwide. But also, I have daughters, so I know that they would call that fast fashion. And I think what fast fashion means is it's a style that might get thrown out in 6 months or a year. It's less expensive. So I know fast fashion is a sustainability issue, or a lot of people would say it's a sustainability issue. So the idea that we're buying disposable stuff and air freighting it over here is the ultimate in sustainability sin, so to speak. But also, when we talk about air freight, generally speaking, it's higher value and lighter. So our mobile phones didn't come on ocean freight. They came by air freight. Vaccines, medicine, stuff like that's high value. So relative to ocean freight, the more expensive stuff that's lighter flies on planes. Am I correct to say that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite ones is every diamond effectively that moves in the world goes by a plane. Nobody puts diamonds on container ships.
By the way, I can tell you this because when I worked on China programs many moons ago, we had a launch coming in China, and the parts weren't ready. The parts weren't ready, and finally, I said air freight them, and it cost an extra $400,000 over ocean freight. And there was some discussions about that after the fact. And what you learn in automotive is you don't get paid, you don't get killed for spending too much. You get killed for not launching on time.
Yep.
So we launched on time and I got yelled at. Anyway, next thing I want to talk to you about is, I think this is an interesting one. We're in a freight recession. We just talked about that. And by the way, it's not hitting air freight. And it's not necessarily hitting containerized, but it's definitely hitting the over-the-road market. So we're in a freight recession, yet the economy is doing pretty well. Please explain how both of those can be true at the same time.
Yeah, and this is one that I think causes a lot of confusion to folks. And what it's important to understand is that when you look at what generates, and specifically on the trucking space, about 59% of demand on a ton mile basis. So again, the metric that economists use to think about demand, 59% of demand comes from domestic manufacturing. About another 30% comes from wholesaling. And then e-commerce, mining activity, and then warehousing make up the remaining 10%. So if you have to think about it, retailers don't ship by truck when we mean retail physical establishment that comes from a warehouse. And so when you look at those sectors, effectively 95% of US freight demand for trucking is made up by less than 20% of our GDP, with manufacturing accounting for about 10% of GDP. And then if you combine warehousing and wholesale trade together, and mining, you get about another 10%. And even within that, the manufacturing sector that contributes the most to GDP is computers and electronic products, and they contribute hardly anything to freight volume. And essentially, the disconnect can occur because how GDP is calculated. Frankly, the sectors that contribute the most to trucking freight, some of them, like paper manufacturing, have very minor influence. Same with non-metallic mineral product manufacturing, like clay bricks and glass and things of that sort.
Interesting, because I have experienced that myself when I talk to people, when I talk to friends who are outside the space and they go, hey, how's biz or whatever. And I always say, we're in a kind of a freight recession. And they go, oh, what do you mean? Because the economy is not doing gangbusters, but it's doing okay. And by the way, I told you this before we hit record. I know a lot of people looking for work for over 6 months right now. Just the anecdotal stuff that we feel and see in our day-to-day world, that doesn't necessarily mean the whole economy is feeling that.
No, exactly. I know we were looking it up, and long-term unemployment rates, they're about 1.4% right now. The Bureau of Labor Statistics defines long-term employment as 15 weeks or more. And 1.4%, that's not insignificant, but it was 1.4% in 2018. And so the part of the economy we're very familiar with is struggling, but the overall economy just isn't doing bad. And that's why I think it's so important that we let the data rather than our emotions necessarily drive the decision making.
Right. And I think we did have, after COVID, we had inflation that was high. And so we saw this big rise in prices. And usually wages don't keep up with the prices going up. So it takes a little while for you to get the boss to give you more money because everything costs more. So I think if you ask somebody how's the economy doing, they'll say, oh God, I just paid this much for whatever, groceries or a car or whatever. So they have that sense that it's not going, but that inflation, I'm going to say it's in the past, but we had the big run up. Things aren't still going up at that fast rate. Thank God.
No, exactly.
They're not going back either.
And this is one of the biggest problems with, quite frankly, and this is going to make me sound like an elitist academic, but I am. So no other way to put that. Asking the average American about the economy is it may be useful to understand where people are thinking from a voting standpoint, but it's absolutely not informative from an understanding how is the economy doing standpoint. Because you ask most people, they want to see incredibly strong deflation in products. And as an economist, it's, oh my God, we do not want overall economy-wide deflation. Like, you need to go read economic history of how bad things were in the early 1920s when there was 10% deflation and it was catastrophically bad.
Yeah. Your counterparts over at University of Michigan, by the way, as soon as you leave Big Ten country, U of M and MSU just feel like one school. Because
yeah, and boy, are they not.
Yeah, but your counterparts in Ann Arbor, they have that, I think it's consumer confidence report that they do. And I always think that's very interesting to look at because, and it gets quoted quite a bit. So it was smart from a institution perspective. That'll tell you where people's minds are at. Not necessarily what the numbers are doing. You'll tell us that, but they'll say, oh, I feel this way. Right?
Yeah, I'll admit I've lost all faith in that data, not because it's U of M, but just because it's just not mirrored reality. The fact that consumer confidence in 2021, when people were loaded with money, was as low as it was, just is telling me it's picking up other dynamics. And there's too many issues with confidence flipped in 2020. We could see it in the data. Magically, come December of 2016, Republicans were a lot more confident than what they were in October 2016. And so that's where you have to say there's so much politics in here. And it's not predictive of consumer spending anymore is the challenge.
People are irrational. And it's funny, my son-in-law is a financial planner. And he said, every election you get, the day after, somebody will call up, regardless of who wins. The end of the world happened. My candidate didn't win. I want to sell everything. He goes, if I could have one stock that I could say, yeah, sell this one. He goes, and you have to talk whoever off of the ledge that day. Anyway.
No. And so I just pulled up just on Fred to just pick on things. So we had dips in consumer confidence in August of 2011, and I'm not even sure why that is. It was lower than during the global financial crisis and the worst points where we were losing 800,000 jobs a month. And believe it or not, consumer confidence, the all-time low potentially recorded by, or near the all-time low, recorded by the University of Michigan was in July of 2022, which is arguably at the strongest single point in US labor market history ever. And so that's where you're just picking up people are upset about higher prices, but ignoring all this other information.
I always say it when we're talking more on sales stuff. People buy for very irrational reasons, and people are irrational. And again, that's what you're picking up, which must be very painful for a numbers wonk like you.
It what it does for me is it's why I put nuts on a lot of data and saying, hey, you can't read too much into this yet. So that reading was almost at the same time period where quit rates were 25 or 30% higher than what they were before COVID. And so that's where it's just, this isn't mirroring reality. You shouldn't be convinced the world is ending at the moment.
Yes, yes. It's funny. Just before he died, Charlie Munger, I saw a quote by him. He was like 100 years old when he died. And he said, I'm about to die. I'm a very old man and I'm optimistic. You're young. You, of course, should be optimistic. So, anyway, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about, in speaking of data, is data. So, the world is all of a sudden consumed with artificial intelligence, machine learning, and for good reason. I think we all see the value in this, but we have to have good data to use those tools. And I know I've talked to you many times, you use data from the federal government, and you said it is the best data that doesn't get used very much by anybody. So you have all these analysis. And again, guys, if you're not following Jason on LinkedIn, you need to. I'll put a link to his LinkedIn profile. But we have a lot of data out there now, more data than ever, but we don't necessarily feel good about loading all that data into our large language learning models or our machine learning models because it is dirty, it is polluted. And so tell us what we need to do. No one knows data more than you.
Yeah, so the most important thing with any data is to ask yourself, what is the process that is generating this data? So what is that data generating process? And so once you get a sense of that, you can start saying, okay, what interpretations does it make sense to attach to this? And so where I see a lot of issues made is you have, if a data generating process, we were talking about this before we started recording, the more humans touch it and have a potential to manipulate it, especially to manipulate it in their favor, the more concern you can have. As an example from academic research, there's a paper that looked at how the airlines used to report on-time arrival data before it was automatically transmitted from the plane's computer to the control center. And it was fascinating. There were these huge spikes at 0 minutes late, so it was exactly on time, and then 14 minutes late. And that was because the threshold for a late arrival was 15 minutes that would get recorded in documents. So you see this histogram with a couple spikes, and it's a mystery. Amazingly, once they went to using automatic computer recording, that histogram, those spikes disappeared, and you had smooth distributions. And so you have to look and say, what is the process that is bringing about these scores that are being recorded? And once you have an understanding of the process, then you can start to think and attach an interpretation to that data. And you have to look and try to go defend what that interpretation is. And in some cases, it's going to be very clear cut. As an example, FTR and ACT Research both report Class 8 truck order data. They're going out, they're getting the data from the manufacturers, they're reporting numbers that tend to be very similar to each other. You use one, use the other, take an average. That is going to be a very good indicator of what this underlying idea of Class 8 truck orders are. Where you get potentially greater challenges is when you don't have nearly as clear of a data generating process that can exist out there. And so that's what I just always urge people to ask is if you're purchasing data, if you're using data, you need to understand what is the process that was used to generate these specific scores. And that gets us way before we even start thinking about artificial intelligence. I'll admit, I'm an AI skeptic because when I start thinking about the incremental contributions of each and every set of innovations we've had since roughly about 1850, they've tended to be less and less in terms of how they've changed life and society. And so, as an example, electrification was a ridiculously huge deal. And that's not that old, folks. Like, that's starting in the 1880s that we start the real process with Edison and Westing, or with GE and Westinghouse here in the US. That fundamentally changes the human existence. Adding computers fundamentally changed things. Adding the internet changed things, but not as much as computers, and computers are a lot less than electrification. And so you start getting and asking the question, is AI going to be as revolutionary as the computer? I don't see how that can be the case, because historically all of these great innovations are less impactful. And the easiest way to think about it is infant mortality rates. You go back 120 years, 20% of children born in the United States did not live past their first year. That number had fallen tremendously by 1970. Are we lower today than in 1970? Yes. But that curve looks like an exponential curve. And right now, we are darn near on that bottom, about as low as we can go. And so my attitude with AI is a lot of the things that it's going to focus on are probably things where we're already at the bottom of the curve in terms of improvement. It certainly is going to be beneficial in helping to automate things that previously couldn't be automated. But I am just not convinced at the end of the day that it's going to be quite as revolutionary as folks think it's going to be.
Jason, I this is old man stuff to say, but I'll say it anyway. I remember when we got computers at work and we had one workstation that we would be like, hey, can I use that? Jason, can I use the computer when you're done? There's 20 of us sharing a computer. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, we got 3 of them. The idea that we could all somehow get by, do our work with only 3 computers is crazy to think about now. And I remember even when I got internet at work, the internet was out there, very little stuff on it. But we had intranets. So the idea that you work at Michigan State and you can have access to anything at Michigan State, but we don't want you checking sports scores or your stocks, right? It was, and this is how I think about it. Sometimes when we see innovations, and maybe you can tell me whether I'm right to say this, we expect, oh, the computer's going to change everything. It's very slow. And then all of a sudden it just hits, where all of a sudden, because we had the 2001, I think, bust of all the first round of internet startups like pets.com. There was like I remember I tracked 50 of the top stocks in 2001. They all went out of business. They either got bought for pennies on the dollar or just went out of business. And these were the gold standard of the new internet. Gone.
Yep. No, and I agree with you. I think certainly jobs that are very information centric, we could not do them without the internet and things like that. Where I think of like innovations that change society is like you think about, take food manufacturing, right? The way we make food today on an industrial basis does not differ that much fundamentally than what we did 100 years ago with your Swifts and your mega meat packers. Yes, it's much more capital intensive today than it was back then. But the overall production process used by so many industries, and the industries that even exist, haven't changed that much over a century. No, the big one that does exist today that didn't exist a century ago is that computers and electronic products piece. But when you think about it, AI is just an extension of that industry. It's not a fundamentally new industry that exists out there. And so that's where I've always been skeptical of the evolutionary nature of technology. And again, I think we can see this in digital brokerage, right? I remember a decade ago when all the digital truckload brokerages were getting started up, and it's going to put C.H. Robinson out of business and it's going to completely revolutionize the space. And I remember even at the time just getting my PhD and studying trucking and not being nearly as focused on the economics of it, but saying, Not sure that's going to be the case. And we've seen, yeah, Convoy's gone. A lot of these digital brokerages, they didn't revolutionize how shippers obtain freight and how
They
truck transportation.
they improved some of the technical aspects of it for sure. The customers, I think, like that technology and the data that they can get. But yeah, to your point, it wasn't it didn't drive all those dinosaurs out. We have always have companies like CH Robinson now, you mentioned them, are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on technology. So it's not like those guys were all flat footed. They knew what they're doing. When we talk about this, you mentioned the data in general. You're a big data guy. I know you mentioned DAT. I know you're a big fan of the DAT data, and you're also a big user of the federal data. But as we go forward, we're going to have more and more data that that all of these Internet of Things throws off. And I've joked about this. I have this puny human brain, and I like key performance indicators, KPIs. So if I'm running a warehouse or a freight brokerage or whatever, manufacturing, I want 5 key performance areas, right? Something with cost, quality, some timing, whatever I'm tracking, right? Maybe 5. But that's because that's all I want those 5 that will tell me what the majority of the other metrics are going to be aligned to those if they're positive. But I think of data now, we can collect so much data. So all these Internet of Things can collect all this data, but it's not useful to me. I can't do anything. If you give me 30 metrics rather than just 5, it does me no good. I'm just still going to lean on those 5. But I think, you tell me, AI will be able to say, yeah, give me all this, give me all the data you have, because I will make sense of it. So I'm hoping that we'll have some better insights. Your thoughts?
So I think it'll depend on the application. Where I think AI will be incredibly beneficial is actually for activities that don't involve humans. Humans are in a lot of cases a problem because we're so darn unpredictable. So drug discovery, AI is going to be phenomenal. AI will revolutionize how pharmaceutical drug discovery is done because these are chemical processes, and you will train AI systems that are going to be better than any scientist is going to be. It's seen all the complexities of mixing hundreds of different chemicals together and how this will interact with a system that is essentially a biological entity. It'll be phenomenal for engineering. It's going to be phenomenal for chemistry and the development of new materials. You'll probably see the chemical manufacturers will be some of the biggest investors in this to discover new compounds, new materials, and things of this sort. Where it's going to struggle is anything economics or human related. And that's because things are unpredictable as we involve humans. I think, and especially because a lot of the data that's generated is inherently hard to measure and it's more prone to have error. I can track chemical reactions ridiculously well. Measuring warehouse worker productivity, that's a lot harder to do.
Yeah.
It is. And that's where I think that the AI applications that we're going to see in the more hard science areas are going to be absolutely phenomenal. Is it going to revolutionize how we do forecasting and retailing? Probably not, because most people are still uncomfortable with an ARIMA model, and ARIMA is now almost going on 60 years. So I tend to think that AI is going to have its place, but it may be less in human-centric systems where at the end of the day, I still don't think it's going to get as close as where humans are to managing these things. I used to work landscaping while I was an undergrad, and I just chuckle at thinking how an AI algorithm could have figured out my productivity, what it would have been like this last week in Michigan, because I
It's
guarantee,
hot as hell. Yeah.
yeah, it was going to be horrible. And what's that computer going to say? Like, that computer can't go out and feel what it is to work in 90-degree, 80% humidity heat. And so that's where I chuckle a little bit because I'm like, the computer still can't feel that and understand that. And so I'm Internet of Things will be interesting, but like you said, figuring out what to do with the data. The challenge is too, the AI algorithm may figure it out, but then the humans got to implement it. And if the human doesn't know what this thing did, it's going to be like, oh boy, do I want to stake my job on what Mr. Black Box here on the computer said? I don't think so.
That's very true. I forgot the guy's name. I interviewed the founder of AI Fleet. And so it's a asset-based trucking company, and they use their AI software to maximize driver utilization. A lot of people listening go, everybody does that, right? But they say we're getting, I think it was 30, 40% more utilization. And they originally started this company with the idea that it would be a software company. But what they realized, I think they were smart to realize this, is that a lot of the things that from the driver utilization was counterintuitive. So I can give that to Jason Miller and Joe Lynch, and we look at it, and we've been in trucking for 20 years and go, this is not right. I don't care what the black box says. So they said, we're going to have to do this ourselves, eat our own oatmeal. And I keep thinking, if I gave you something right now and it said, AI said, this is the way you should schedule your day, Jason, and you look and go, no, it has no idea. And say, no, we've studied you for the last 3 years, Jason. This absolutely positively is the answer. This is the way you should schedule your day. You'd be like, no, I'm not doing it. And I know this, I read some books about AI. It comes to some conclusions that might be right, but it's very counterintuitive. So it's going to be, do we believe it? and maybe one of the reasons we don't believe it is because it's not right, because it doesn't know that it was 90 degrees and 80% humidity last week.
No, and that's and we are seeing the folks at Optimal Dynamics are doing
yes
approaches that with trucking, probably the biggest challenge is folks don't think probabilistically enough. And that's, I know, Warren Powell, through his research since the 1980s, has been really hammering home to folks. And to the extent maybe AI can get folks to think in that those probabilistic terms, it will generate a lot of improved outcomes. And so the one thing though I'm always cautious on is, I will tell you what, in most industries in the United States, the 10th percentile firm in an industry and the 90th percentile firm, the 90th percentile firm is double the productivity of the 10th percentile. Are we just seeing an example of that playing out, and it happens to be an AI entity?
I know I don't think in probabilistic terms because I don't even know if I could pronounce it, and I know I don't know how to define it.
Every outcome has a probability distribution to it, and so you're trying to figure out in the long run. If you think about it, if I'm just as a simple example, let's say I'm shipping from East Lansing to Atlanta. There's a probability distribution on what are going to be the rates that I'm going to receive out of Atlanta to, let's say, getting me back towards Michigan, as well as the number of loads, right? There's two data generating processes here, rate per load and number of loads. If I have a good sense of that and I factor that in, then I now know how to price accurately. I now know how to think about things. And so that's where data visibility, if we combine it with the right tools, can be absolutely phenomenal. Do we need AI to completely do that? I think that's a different, more open question.
Love it. I love it. Jason, I'm going to summarize, then I'm going to get your final thoughts. So I'm talking to my friend, Jason Miller, and it's Market Insights with Supply Chain Economist, Jason Miller. And we talked about three major areas. The first area is the freight markets. And we first talked about over the road, which it's not just capacity. It's also we're going to have to see something that drives the demand up. Next, we talked about containerized freight doing very well, even with some of the disruptions around the world. And also, kudos to the logistics folks that we're not having any material flow problems to our manufacturing. So that means all these problems around the world we're accommodating. You talked about air freight, still doing well, and maybe some changes in the future related to some lax compliance to the rules. And then we talked about the freight recession. So we are in a freight recession, and the economy is doing relatively well. So don't think because your day-to-day is hard that the entire economy is hard. Last but not least, we talked about data and AI. Obviously, the key to AI is data, and we have to clean that up, and we have to have better data. So we're really in a phase of AI readiness, And Jason isn't 100% convinced that AI is going to revolutionize things. It's going to at least incrementally improve things, but it's not going to transform everything. Anyway, final thoughts. Put a big old bow on this one, Jason Miller.
Yeah, this has been fun. I think it gets back to it. If this is all that we're talking about here is effectively decision making, because we're trying to work off of different pieces of data, whether it's information about the economy, information about freight pricing, and we're trying to form essentially a coherent story and picture of how the world is today, and then make some forecasts. I'm going to say qualitative forecasts about where the world's going to be, let's say 6 months from now. A lot of this, you can't put in a model and get a regression parameter or get a statistic. A lot of it's value judgment based on experience that's going to be hard to quantify. And I think the other thing is you can't do any of this if you don't understand where's the data coming from, how is it being generated, and therefore should I have faith in it. Just to end with, as a good example, economists at the Atlanta Fed have paused their calculation of this thing called the wage growth tracker, tying into what we're talking about for wage growth. And the reason is they've flagged something internally with some reweighting of the current population statistics survey that provides the basis for that. So you have professional economists working for the Federal Reserve who said, wait, I'm going to hit the pause button because I want to make sure that we're doing this right. That is the one thing and a lesson I think in industry we have to learn a lot more, is that we don't hit that pause button. We love to put data out there. We love to make bold claims out of it, but we may not be doing a good enough job to saying, hey, is this measuring what I think it's measuring? Does this seem intuitively right? And so that's what I always urge people, is being first ain't necessarily the best.
Yep. Jason, one of the things as you were saying that, it occurred to me that the world is one way the world is transforming right now is people like you mentioned DAT and the data they create. We now have the ability to make a lot of our decisions with data. And for a long time, it was still what we call tribal knowledge. It was still a gut feel, just experience. And our data was so often trailing, and it was like, hey, last month's data is here. And it was like, it was useful, but not that useful because it was so hard to compile. Now our data is pretty much real time, and we can have insights that are not weeks and months behind, but hopefully just a day behind. And I think we're getting to the place where we're starting to say we can make better decisions because we have real data based on what we think is going to happen. And that is a transformational thing. And wrong way to say it. It's an incremental thing because our data is getting incrementally better.
No, it is. And the government's doing their best to continue to improve things. And I will say one thing is important thing for everybody to remember is a lot of data, a lot of industry level data. It's like steering a battleship. Stuff doesn't change, in 1 month. COVID got, I think, folks attuned to the idea that things could switch on a dime. And it's important to understand that's not normal. Today, we're in a much more normal world. I tell a lot of folks, basically take March of 2023, probably till about much of 2022 even, pretend that didn't exist. That wasn't normal. Now look at the fundamentals, because we're now back to a more fundamentally based world with the understanding that some things have changed, but the more things change, the more they stay the same.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Jason. We have to do this more often. It's been a while. I always enjoy having you on my podcast.
No, it has. Absolutely.
And thank all of you for listening to my podcast. Your support is very much appreciated. Until next time, onward and upward. You have been listening to the Logistics of Logistics podcast, where we engage with leaders in the logistics and supply chain community. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave us a nice review on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you listen. Also, please check out our videos on YouTube and connect with us on LinkedIn. We're very big on LinkedIn. And you can also reach us on the logisticsoflogistics.com, our website.